Getting fired is already hard, but getting fired from your own company is absolutely brutal. I put together 8 CEOs who were fired from their own companies and why. Starting with the most iconic and well-known, Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs famously founded Apple in 1976 with his longtime friend out of the garage in Los Altos, California. The two decided that they would split responsibilities in the company, with Jobs being the ideas guy and the business guy, and Wozniak being behind the engineering. The only problem was that they were a pair of 20-something-year-olds and neither had business experience. So to accommodate their lack of experience, they built a board. But even with this newly formed board, Jobs still wanted to be CEO, but the board pushed back. Specifically, one of Apple's early investors, Mike Markkula. He didn't think Jobs had the discipline to do the job. One of the board's main issue was the way Jobs treated people. I mean, by now it's virtually folklore how Jobs was with the people that he worked with. He was known for pushing people incredibly hard, rubbing people the wrong way, and burning bridges left and right. And as a result, Markkula brought in his friend Michael Scott as an experienced executive. But Scott eventually left the company after what was known as Black Wednesday, where Scott personally fired 40 employees abruptly, including half of the Apple II team. That's when Jobs stepped in 1983 and recruited John Sculley with the now legendary pitch: do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world? Jobs being ever the persuader, but this would eventually come back to bite Jobs. Because right around the time when he began to work on the Macintosh, cultivating the now famous 1984 commercial, things really started to get rocky. The two just couldn't get on the same page. Jobs favored the Macintosh over every other product that Apple was working on, and initially it came out of the gate hot. Sales were strong. However, because it was slow and it didn't have a lot of compatible software, we all know that Apple is notorious for having a closed software system. Sales took a slump during the second half of 1984. Sculley was more in love with the Apple II because of its open architecture. He wanted Apple to target education, small businesses, and home markets that would avoid competition with IBM. But Jobs saw closed architecture as a way to get an edge on IBM. Their differences were so strong that the two products were treated as separate divisions of the company. On the Macintosh side was Steve Jobs, and on the Apple II side was John Sculley. And even though the Apple II accounted for 85% of sales in the early part of 1985, in the January 1985 annual meeting, the Apple II was not even mentioned, nor its employees. I, for one, think that is hilarious. But many of the Apple employees did not, and a lot of them left, including Steve Wozniak, who stated that the company had been going in the wrong direction for the last 5 years. During this time, Wozniak also sold most of his stock. As if this wasn't enough of a blow, the Macintosh had truly failed to overtake IBM, and the apparent defeat was clear. This gave Sculley the upper hand, and he was approached by Arthur Rock, one of Apple's early investors, to reorganize the company. One of the moves that he made was moving Jobs from being the head of the Macintosh to being in charge of new product development. This left Jobs in a really weird spot. He was virtually powerless over the company he had spent his life building. In response, Jobs decided to approach the board and form a coup against Sculley, another move that would again backfire on Jobs. The board would side with Sculley, and a few months later, Jobs would submit his letter of resignation. However, Jobs would say that he was fired, but from Sculley's perspective, Jobs voluntarily stepped down. Even after Jobs was removed from Apple, the Macintosh continued to suffer, while Jobs would go on to found Next and become one of the first people to fund Pixar Studios. Absolutely legendary. Things took a turn in Jobs' favor in 1996 after Apple was struggling. Its survival depended on creating another operating system. Apple would try to acquire B Inc., a now defunct computer company, but the acquisition would ultimately fail, leading to Apple ultimately coming into a deal with Next for $400 million, bringing Jobs back into the company that he founded, and, well, you know the rest. Even though this story had a happy ending, things don't always end this well, especially for the next CEO on this list, Adam Neumann. At this point, the story of Adam Neumann and WeWork are pretty much a modern parable of what happens when hype meets reality. Adam Neumann founded WeWork in 2010 after his first company, Crawlers, a baby's clothing company, failed to take off. Neumann and his partner Miguel McAvee met through a friend, and the two began working on GreenDesk, a sustainability shared workspace and the predecessor to WeWork. So Neumann had already built experience in the shared office space, But the pair would sell their interest in GreenDesk and take that money along with a $15 million investment from a New York real estate investor and would start WeWork. From the outside looking in, WeWork seemed to be a rocket ship, raising a staggering $350 million in just 4 years, giving the company a $5 billion valuation. Valuations are so weird, and this one was obviously inflated. It was followed by another investment from the legendary Japanese investor Masayoshi Son, who initially raised $3.1 billion in 2017, and then another $7 billion, totaling $10 billion. This gave WeWork a valuation of $47 billion. But the company was basically built on Neumann's outlandish personality and bold claims of where the company was going. However, there's only so much talking you can do before you have to actually, do something. In 2019, WeWork decided to go public, and that's when things started to crumble. Because when you go public, there are certain rules that you have to follow that private companies simply just don't. One of them being opening your books and disclosing how your company is actually making money. When the time came for WeWork to disclose its financials, it exposed the fact that its business model was incredibly expensive and the company had virtually no path to profitability. Plainly put, the company was losing a ton of money. One of the big reasons was because of how WeWork determined the market size of the shared workspace industry. They projected it to be up to $3 trillion. According to this article from The Guardian, WeWork, quote, counted anyone who worked at a desk in an American city where there was a WeWork as a potential member. In 9 US cities with WeWorks, the estimate applied to anyone with an office job. Like, what? That's like a gym counting everyone with legs as a member. Following WeWorks' abysmal profit and loss statements and his failed attempt to go public, Neumann would step down as CEO of the company. This caused WeWork to drop from a $47 billion to a $10 billion valuation, a nearly 80% loss in value. And in 2023, WeWork filed for bankruptcy. Neumann has continued to seek out new ventures such as Flow, where he received a $350 million investment from the legendary investor Mark Andreessen. This man is OP with his persuasive abilities, and yet still nothing has taken off. But what's probably worse than getting fired from your own company and watching it burn to the ground is getting fired from your own company and you having to watch it turn into a massive behemoth by one of the greatest entrepreneurs of all time, which was the case for Martin Eberhard and Tesla. In 2003, Eberhard co-founded Tesla with his longtime friend Mark Tarpenning because of his love for sports cars, but worried that global warming and the reliance on imported oil became a huge concern. The pair decided that the EV car was the solution. In 2004, about a year after the company was founded, one of the best and worst things happened to Tesla's co-founders. Elon Musk, who had just sold PayPal for $1.5 billion, of which he received $175 million, invested $7.5 million in a Series A funding round and became the chairman of the board. Here we go. Eberhard and Musk butted heads because Musk believed that Eberhard was holding up production and other operational issues. So Musk ultimately ousted Eberhard, to which Eberhard would respond by suing Musk and claiming that Elon, quote, lied about his background and fictionalized pieces of his resume to embellish the truth. To which Musk would respond, the facts are that when I requested through AC Propulsion to meet Eberhard, he had no technology on his own. He did not have a prototype car, and he owned no intellectual property relating to electric cars. All he had was a business plan to commercialize the AC Propulsion T0 electric sports car concept. 3 years later, when Eberhard was asked to leave Tesla, most of the work that he had been paid to do had to be redone. Ultimately, the two would settle the lawsuit. Eberhard basically won the right to be recognized as one of the founders of Tesla. I mean, okay. The next CEO on our list took a fall because of professional blunders. This is the story of Jerry Yang, the founder of Yahoo. In 1994, while at Stanford, Jerry Yang, along with fellow student David Philo, met while working on a project they had pretty much hated. And when their professor took a sabbatical, they used it as an opportunity to bail on the work. With this new free time, Yang and Philo found themselves surfing the internet frequently, as the birth of the internet had just begun. While they really enjoyed the pastime of surfing the newfound web, they realized that the internet was a big mess. Anytime they found a site that they actually loved, they knew it would be impossible to find it again. And out of this frustration, they came up with an idea to build a sort of roadmap for online users. And in 1994, they posted their first online guide under David and Jerry's Guide to the Web. As this list grew, by November of that same year, the site had 170,000 visitors a day. And by 1998, Yahoo was receiving 1 million visitors to the site a day. This newfound success garnered the attention of AOL, Microsoft, and Prodigy, who were looking to buy the company from the young entrepreneurs. But the pair rejected all the offers, admitting that they were in it for the sheer love of building, not for the money. Which was probably a gift and a curse, because this same attitude would come back to bite Jerry later. Because in 2008, Jerry would come under heavy pressure from the board of Yahoo after Microsoft offered a whopping $45 billion to purchase the company. Jerry declined. Yang believed that they should be getting more money, and he continued to haggle with Microsoft. I don't know, man, but $45 billion sounds like more money to me. This frustrated investors and shareholders, led by one of the most hard-charging investors on Wall Street, Carl Icahn, reminding Yang of his responsibility to maximize return for shareholders. This pressure eventually came to a peak, and in 2008, Yang resigned from the company. Yang went on to build his own investment firm, AME Cloud Ventures, and is now worth an estimated $3 billion. But Yang wasn't the only CEO on this list to be wrong about the future. The next pair of CEOs on our list completely missed where their industry was heading and essentially crashed their whole company. This is what happened to Mike Laziridis and Jim Balsillie with BlackBerry. In 1992, Mike Laziridis and Jim Balsillie founded Research in Motion. Initially, Balsillie wanted to purchase the company outright, but instead invested $125,000 and became a co-founder. BlackBerry was an instant hit with C-suite executives and rich and famous people, which is typically how these things start out. They were beloved for their always-on, always-connected wireless capabilities that we've come to love so much. BlackBerry saw an explosion from 2001 to 2007 and became a global company. Its standout product was the BlackBerry Pearl series. But this meteoric rise did not last long, because in 2006, the OSC, which is Canada's equivalent to the SEC, began an investigation of the company. Amidst these investigations was infighting between Laziridis and Balsillie. The two had disagreements on where they thought the company should be going. Balsillie wanted to shift more towards instant messaging software, while Laziridis wanted to just stick with keyboard-based devices. The board could tell that there was a cultural problem inside of the company. The BlackBerry Z10 was supposed to be the competition to Apple and Google, but Laziridis could not see the opportunity in this device. While pointing to a BlackBerry with a keyboard, he was quoted as saying, "I get this. It's clearly differentiated." He proceeded to point to a touchscreen phone and say, "I don't get this." Wow. It's amazing to see how someone who was such a visionary could not see the touchscreen phone coming. And then the iPhone and the Android dropped. Could you imagine having all of this happening at one time? Infighting, a government crackdown, and one of the greatest technological shifts of all time, all mixed into one. Yep, they were cooked. The cataclysmic turn of events caused BlackBerry's market share to drop by nearly 3/4. This would be it for Balsillie, and shortly after he resigned from the board and cut his ties with the company. Laziridis will follow suit, and the company has not recovered since. But the BlackBerry executives weren't the only victims of a company's stock market crash. The next CEO on our list was ousted from his own company after his company missed sales and profit expectations. This was what happened to Andrew Mason and Groupon. In 2008, Mason founded Groupon. It started as a social platform, but Mason realized that his original idea was just too abstract to market. So he stripped it down to what we know now as Groupon, a website that sells deals to local businesses. Groupon saw an insane rise, earning hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue a month in its first 2 years. This growth thrust Groupon into $1 billion valuation. On their rise up, they even garnered an offer from Yahoo and Google. When Yahoo reached out to Mason and Groupon, he apparently reached out to Google and said, "Hey, we have an offer from Yahoo. Are you guys interested?" Obviously, Google was super interested, to the tune of $6 billion. But Mason turned down that offer because he figured that it would be fun to do an independent company, and he believed that he could make more money that way. Now, the board was happy that Mason had his sights set high, but they also wanted to know what was the next strategy that he was going to employ. They wanted him to go public. It was the next logical step. So in 2011, Groupon went public, and as Mason puts it, quote, "There had been very little negative press, and everything was going swimmingly. And then we entered this quiet period, and we just got hammered. It had turned the overall tenor from this intense but wonderful ride to this kind of embattled, highly stressful fight." The SEC scrutinized their accounting methods, and an analyst told the Associated Press, quote, "Groupon is a disaster. It's a shield that's going to be exposed pretty soon." And people around him were telling him to ignore the stock price and ignore the press, but Mason knew that even if he ignored the stock price and the press, his employees wouldn't. So in 2012, the board would give Mason one more chance to prove himself. But 2 weeks later, Mason and his CFO received a call from their controller letting them know that they had forgotten to accrue a profit sharing tax. And that cost them $10 million. And they missed their numbers. And that was it. Mason was fired by the board. But it's one thing to miss your numbers and get ousted, but it must suck to be doing everything right and still get fired, especially when you're right in the middle of spearheading a technological revolution. This was the case for Sam Altman and OpenAI. Back in 2015, OpenAI was founded and funded by Sam Altman amongst other heavy hitters like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Microsoft, and AWS. Altman and the OpenAI team sought to bring in the top researchers, and they needed a large amount of cash, not only to pay these researchers, but the cost of cloud computing. In 2017, OpenAI spent $7.9 million, a quarter of its functional expenses on cloud computing alone. In 2022, OpenAI announced GPT 3.5 and literally broke the internet. This thrusted the company, Altman, and the world of AI into mainstream attention. The preview of the model received over 1 million signups in the first 5 days. This rise to stardom would lead Altman to be named one of the 100 most influential people in the world and CEO of the year by Time magazine. But these high times didn't last long for Altman, because a lot of the original members of the board, like Reid Hoffman, Peter Thiel, and Elon Musk, they all left, which allowed the remaining board members to come after Altman pretty heavily. One of the main reasons was the board's disagreements with Altman about the safety of AI. Elon Musk would even go on to sue Altman, alleging they broke the company's founding agreement by focusing more on profit over impact to humanity. Altman was also seeking money from sovereign wealth funds to begin developing AI chips to compete with NVIDIA. One of Altman's main rivals in this fallout was OpenAI's chief scientist Ilya Sutskever, who was strongly against Altman's plan to raise money for chips under the OpenAI name. Altman retaliated by reducing Sutskever's role in the company, to which Sutskever would engage in his own retaliations by appealing to the board. And he was successful. And on November 17, 2023, the board ousted Altman. Just a few days after Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella announced that Altman will be spearheading the advanced AI research team at Microsoft. This caused an uproar with the OpenAI team, and 738 out of 707 employees, even Sutskever, signed an open letter stating that they would leave OpenAI from Microsoft if they allowed this to happen. So Altman gave the board one more chance to negotiate, and a day later Altman will return to his prior role with OpenAI. So I guess all's well that ends well, right?